I thought I was alone in the forest, until someone started moving my campsite. The first thing I noticed was that my dog was staring at the empty trail, not barking, not growling, just staring. Her body was completely still, and her ears were pointed toward the trees, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. I whispered her name. She didn't look at me. Then I heard it. A single footstep, somewhere beyond the trees. I froze. A few seconds passed, then another. Closer. At the time, I told myself it was a deer. That was the easy explanation. What I didn't know was that someone had already been inside my campsite. And by the time I realized it, they had been watching me for hours. This happened a few years ago in Northern Oregon. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I used to go camping whenever work started getting too stressful. Nothing fancy. I'd throw a sleeping bag, tarp, food, water, and a small backpack into my truck and find somewhere far enough from town that I couldn't hear traffic. I preferred dispersed camping over actual campgrounds. Less people, less noise. And honestly, I liked the feeling that I could disappear for a night. There was one area of national forest about an hour and a half from where I lived that I went to a few times. It wasn't completely remote. There were logging roads everywhere. Hunters used the area during certain times of the year, and there were old fire roads leading miles into the forest. But once you drove far enough down one of them, you could go hours without seeing another person. One Friday afternoon, I decided to head out there. I hadn't planned on staying more than one night. I packed my dog, a black Labrador named Molly, and left around 4. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. I just texted my brother that I was going camping and would be home the next day. Looking back, that was stupid. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I reached the forest just before sunset. The road was rougher than I remembered. A few miles in, the pavement disappeared completely. Then the gravel got thinner. Eventually, it was just dirt and rocks. I kept driving until I found an old clearing beside a narrow logging road. There was no fire ring, no picnic table, no sign saying anyone had ever camped there. Perfect. I parked the truck facing the road so I could leave quickly if I needed to. I grabbed my pack and walked maybe 200 yards into the trees. There was a small flat area surrounded by fir trees. I set up my tarp between 2 trunks, rolled out my sleeping bag, and tied Molly to a long lead while I collected firewood. She spent most of the time sniffing around. Everything seemed normal. Birds, wind, the occasional crack of a branch. Nothing unusual. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was almost gone. I cooked some food, gave Molly hers, and sat there listening to the forest get darker. Around 9, I heard an engine, far away at first, then louder. A truck came down the logging road. I could hear it moving slowly over the rocks. The headlights appeared through the trees for a few seconds before disappearing again. I assumed it was another camper. The truck stopped somewhere farther down the road. I didn't think anything of it. A door slammed, then another. I heard voices. 2 men, maybe 3. They were talking loudly. I couldn't make out what they were saying. Molly lifted her head. I scratched behind her ears. "You're fine." The voices eventually faded. I figured they'd found a place to camp farther down the road. No big deal. I put out most of the fire around 11 and crawled into the sleeping bag. Molly curled up beside me. I remember falling asleep pretty quickly. The next thing I remember was waking up because she was standing. She was staring toward the trees. I opened my eyes. It was completely dark. For a few seconds, I couldn't figure out why she'd gotten up. Then I heard something, a soft scraping sound, like a boot dragging across dirt. I held my breath. Nothing. Then another sound. This time it came from behind me. I slowly turned my head. There was nothing there, just trees. I reached for my phone. 2:17 a.m. I almost went back to sleep. Then Molly started growling. Very quietly, I sat up. Her eyes were fixed on the edge of the clearing. I whispered her name. She didn't move. That's when I saw it. A tiny light. Maybe a cigarette ember. Maybe a flashlight pointed toward the ground. It was only visible for a second. Then it disappeared. My first thought was that another camper was walking by. But something didn't feel right. There was no road that close to my campsite. Anyone coming from that direction would have had to walk through thick brush. I stayed still. A minute passed, then 5. Nothing. Eventually, Molly laid back down. I told myself I'd imagined it. I wish I had. Around 6 in the morning, I woke up to sunlight coming through the tarp. Molly was already awake. I sat up, stretched, and started packing. Everything looked normal. Until I reached for my backpack. It was gone. For about 2 seconds, I genuinely thought I'd forgotten where I'd put it. Then I saw it. My pack was sitting about 15 feet away, on the other side of the clearing. I stared at it. I knew I'd left it beside my sleeping bag. I always kept it within arm's reach because it had my wallet, keys, and emergency supplies. Molly walked over and sniffed it. I didn't touch it immediately. I just stood there trying to explain it. Maybe I'd moved it during the night. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe I'd kicked it. Then I noticed something else. The zipper was open. Inside, everything had been moved around. My flashlight was on top. My food was underneath it. My knife was gone. I checked the ground. Nothing. Then I noticed the fire. Someone had added wood to it. Not much. Just 2 thick branches. But I hadn't done that. The fire should have been completely dead. Instead, there was still a small amount of warmth under the ash. I suddenly didn't want to be there anymore. I packed as quickly as I could. Molly kept looking toward the trees. Every few seconds, she'd stop and listen. I loaded everything into the truck. Then I walked back toward the campsite one last time to make sure I hadn't left anything. That's when I saw the footprints. They started at the edge of the clearing. Boot prints. Deep ones. Fresh. They came directly toward my tarp, then stopped. There were no footprints going back. I crouched down. My stomach tightened. Whoever had made them had stood right beside where I was sleeping. Maybe for a few seconds. Maybe longer. I grabbed Molly and headed for the truck. I was halfway there when she suddenly stopped. Her body stiffened. She looked behind us. I followed her eyes. Nothing. Then, a branch moved. Not falling. Moving. Slowly. Like someone had just stepped behind it. I whispered, "Come on." Molly wouldn't move. I pulled the leash. She finally followed. We got into the truck. I locked the doors immediately. I started the engine. For a few seconds, I just sat there. I remember thinking I was being paranoid. Then something hit the driver's side window. I jumped. Molly barked. I looked over. Nothing. Just a pine cone lying on the ground beneath the window. Probably fell from the tree. Except there wasn't a tree directly above the truck. I put the truck in reverse. That's when I saw someone. They were standing between the trees about 50 yards behind my campsite. A person. Just standing there, watching me. I couldn't see their face. They weren't wearing bright clothes, just a dark jacket and something on their head. I stared at them. They didn't move. Then they raised one arm, not waving, pointing, directly at my truck. I put the truck into drive and left. I didn't look back. The road was rough enough that I was bouncing around inside the cab, but I didn't slow down. Molly was standing in the passenger seat, looking through the rear window. About a mile down the road, I finally checked my mirror. Nothing. I kept driving. When I reached the main road, I stopped at the first place where I had cell service. I called my brother. I told him what happened. He asked if I wanted him to call the police. I said yes. Later that afternoon, a forest ranger met me near the entrance to the forest. I showed him where I'd camped. He checked the area. He found the footprints. He found my missing knife about 30 feet from the campsite. And he found something else. A second set of footprints, much smaller. They came from the opposite side of the clearing. The ranger followed them for a while. Then they disappeared into the trees. He didn't find the person. But before I left, he asked me something. "Did you hear anybody walking around during the night?" I told him about the sounds, the light, the footsteps. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that still bothers me. He told me that 2 other people had reported someone approaching their campsites in that same area during the previous month. They had assumed it was another camper. Nobody had reported a crime. Nobody had gotten a good look at the person. So there wasn't much anyone could do. I never went camping there again. Actually, I stopped camping alone for a long time. A few months later, I bought a satellite communicator. I started telling people exactly where I was going. And I stopped assuming that being in the middle of nowhere meant nobody else was there. Because that's the thing about forests. They're enormous. You can drive for hours without seeing another person. You can walk miles away from a road. You can build a fire in the middle of nowhere and genuinely believe you're alone. But somebody can still be out there, watching the light from your fire, listening to you move around inside your sleeping bag, waiting until you fall asleep. And sometimes, you don't realize you were never alone until they're already gone. To this day, whenever I camp, I keep my backpack beside me. My shoes stay inside the sleeping bag. My keys stay in my pocket. And before I go to sleep, I always check the trees. Not because I'm afraid of animals. Animals make noise. It's the quiet ones that bother me. Because if someone is close enough to watch you, they don't have to make a sound.